Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Mick Stott, and I'm hosting again program number 40 of our No2Nato series. And as always, we've got some really exciting guests on tonight, some very well-informed guests in the way of Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards, who's an author and former political advisor to the EU ambassador. Wow, that's pretty good going, as I would think you would all agree. And we also have Phil O'Connor, who is Irish Political Review Group. So we've got two fantastic guests tonight. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, there's an awful lot of stuff happening in Moldova, which really is quite alarming, but at the same time, not surprising given what is going on in Europe and the broader element of the world. I mean, what was Evghenia Guțul guilty of, and does the sentence fit the crime is one of the areas we're going to be looking at. We're also going to ask, is her sentence politically motivated? And are there any parallels between the way the opposition voices are treated in Moldova, Ukraine, and Romania? Because it appears there might be. Not surprisingly, I've competed when I was in the military in this region and know that it's not the most open-minded of regions when it comes to security and the way it treats its people. But guess what? We're not that far off getting that way within the UK at the moment with our current dictator. And what role does NATO and the EU play in all of this? Well, I could sort of go on forever about this, but in reality, it's much better that we speak to some people that are far more learned than I. I mean, if we look at the Moldovan leader of the opposition, Evghenia, she was basically the head of an autonomous region of Gagauzia, and she's just been incarcerated for 7 years, and she's been sent to a penal colony. Now, I wouldn't really want to be in her shoes, knowing the way that some of our countries run their prisons. I can only imagine what that might be like. So without further ado, let's start with Lucy.
Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Lucy. How are you? Okay?
I'm fine, thank you. Yes, fine.
It's great to see you back, and nice to have your perspective on this. So, Lucy, from what we know, what was Evghenia Guțul guilty of, and does the sentence, from your perspective, fit the crime?
Well, it certainly seems to be a trumped-up case. I'm not absolutely certain what they're accusing her of. I think it was irregularities concerning funding of political parties. And she herself, I looked at her Twitter feed, her last tweets were back in April, so she's obviously not been able to tweet very much since then. But she was saying that at that time, she was saying this was a fabricated political case against me, a case that has been political, not legal from the very beginning. And we know that she's obviously, they call her the Bakshan of Gagauzia, which is the governor of that region in Moldova. And her party was characterized by being more in favor of good relationships with the Russians. There are obviously Russian-speaking people in that area. It's a complicated area. It's a melting pot because you have Romanians, you have the situation with Transnistria next door, which is in a sort of, like a pencil from the northeast down to the north, or the northeast to the northeast and southeast of the country. So that could eventually end up being the western front of the Russians as they move westwards towards Odessa. But yeah, it looks as though she's the casualty of political maneuverings between the EU and NATO, and of course the Russians, with the EU and NATO seeking to cut her wings prior to this election, which is going to take place in September. They're obviously very worried about her stirring up favourable, stirring up her people again in favour of the Russians, because the EU puppet since 2022 has been Maya Sandu. And it's since then that they've started talking about accession to the European Union. And I think it was only last year, about a year ago, that they started the accession talks. So that's obviously being held over the head of these people. So yes, it's a very political thing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Lucy. And if we can now speak to Philip, if we can welcome Philip.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Hello, Philip. Good to see you.
You too.
Yeah. Philip, same question to you.
Yeah, well, just to add to what Lucy was saying, I mean, we see the same old pattern that a year ago the European Union slapped sanctions on this political figure, and including a travel ban, the EU, including asset freeze, including limiting her access to social media and so forth. So we've seen this before, and they did this under some regulation they have that they invented specifically for what they call actions destabilizing Moldova. And we've seen this pattern before with Georgescu in Romania and with other people, and maybe we'll come to that later on. That this isn't only a modus operandi of the EU in Eastern Europe, but increasingly also in Western Europe. And, so we should look at it in that overall context of what the EU strategy that is being pursued is in relation to consolidating their bloc. So it's quite, again, like Lucy, I don't know the details of the accusations, anything you find on the internet in relation to them. They're pretty vague on what she's being precisely charged, what she was found guilty of. It has to do with funding of parties and all that. And this is, of course, a political cauldron in the east of Moldova, in fact, in the whole of Moldova, and indeed in Romania itself, which lies just to the west of it. And this is not for the first time. We remember it was a cauldron going way back in the Second World War and so on. And we have to remember that the so-called German invasion of Russia wasn't a German invasion of Russia. It was a European invasion of Russia. There were armies from Slovakia, from Romania, from various countries involved. And the Romanians tore through this whole area and incorporated it into Romania down to Odessa, where the Romanians carried out the Holocaust of the huge Jewish population of Odessa. So you're talking about a really area of intense conflict, and also what Samuel Huntington once called one of the fault lines in the conflict of civilizations, where the Orthodox world meets the Western Christian world and so forth. So it's a very complicated area, but somewhere being complicated, which is often used as an excuse, oh, well, no one should try to understand it. Therefore, the same with the Israeli wars. It isn't that complicated. It's the EU seeking to consolidate its territory and seeking to consolidate itself as the political wing of NATO in the confrontation with Russia.
Thank you for that, Philip. And back over to you, Lucy. Do you believe her sentence is politically motivated? And if so, why? Why would you say that's so?
Well, in her own words, what I saw on her Twitter feed, she says, "This is EU political terror. They fear our loyalty to Russia and the Orthodox world. Moldova sold its sovereignty to Brussels." And there was actually a comment on Sputnik yesterday on an article about it. It's very hard to find anything about this in the Western corporate media, of course. But on Sputnik, there was a comment, an interview with an Italian political scientist based in Venice. And his quote was that Guțul's sentencing, her 7-year sentence, he said her sentencing deals a blow to Moldovan democracy, crystallizing fears of authoritarian consolidation weeks before pivotal elections. And his name is Dr. Marsili, and he's at a university in Venice. And I thought that summed it up very, very well. I mean, it's obvious why this is happening now, because the war is moving westwards. It's moving towards Odessa, and this is obviously a critical region close to Odessa. And I understand, I mean, there's a good journalist I saw on the UNS review, a guy called Brett Redmayne, and he's written a series of articles. I only managed to read the first one, which concerns the background, the history of the region of Transnistria and Moldova and Romania. And this, as Phil said, this cauldron, this melting pot of different peoples with their ancient blood feuds, if you will. But yeah, it's obvious. It seems that there have been mercenaries in that area since at least 2022. People who've been masquerading as aid workers, Westerners who've been pretending to be aid workers, who obviously with NATO forces and so on. And it seems that they're going to be preparing a large battle. And it's a great shame. Apparently it's a very beautiful region. Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova, looks down on the Black Sea. It's an area of vineyards and peace and tranquility. And it just seems as though it's unfortunately going to be destroyed, possibly like Mariupol, because it's going to soon be in the eye of the storm, if it's not already.
Absolutely. And the same question to you, Philip.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Lucia said there. And what is astounding is that there's a complete abandonment of any notion of trying to resolve these border issues, what are becoming borderland issues between the EU bloc and Russia. In fact, the whole effort by the EU in this seems to be to trying to consolidate its bloc, and where there are dissidents, they'll be brought to heel. That they're just simply not going to tolerate any wavering on loyalty to the bloc. We got a very revealing comment by the new Chancellor of Germany, the successor of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, who called the thoroughly illegal bombing of Iran that they were doing our dirty work for us. And this is we can now see that this is going to be the yardstick for EU NATO behaviour, and when it feels that its existential interests are at stake. And I think everyone involved in these political questions must now take that into account, that these are the rules of the game. So I'm very, I mean, I feel for people in this particular region, both in Transnistria and in this province in the south of Moldova, because the people living there aren't even Moldovans in what the ethnically main group define it, but they're of Turkic origins, and they're Russian speaking, and they're Orthodox by religion, I believe. And it's peoples like this who are going to find themselves very much caught between the hammer and the anvil. And that's what we're seeing being played out. I think it's like the Georgescu affair. I think they don't even bother with a semblance of constructing a credible case in these cases. And where do you see any reference to what happened in the Romanian parliamentary and presidential elections in any Western coverage of the issues here, where what we're seeing is an exact repeat? And we also have to remember, despite the picture we receive in the Western press, Maya Sandu is very far from the unchallenged leader of Moldova. She lost several elections, various governments she tried to concoct collapsed as they involved parties who did not sympathise with our unilateral EUism, if you like to call it. She and I think in the last time she got elected, it was by 42% of the vote, and what swung it for was the diaspora, so-called diaspora vote in Western Europe. So it's she's in a far more brittle position than is portrayed in Western coverage, the adoring Western coverage she receives in our media here.
I understand, Philip, that they made it very difficult for the diasporans in Russia to vote. Well, they facilitated those who were more in favour of Western Europe and the EU to do so. So using those tricks.
Yeah. I think they allowed two, what do you call it, balloting centres for the whole of Russia.
Wow.
And Western Europe, they had one in virtually every larger city.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how well it is incentivised or coerced in any shape or form. Philip, staying with you, we've seen what Ukraine did to the political opposition and the church there. and how Romanian authorities stopped Georgescu from running in the elections in that country. Do you see any parallels between the way opposition voices are treated in Moldova with Ukraine and Romania? And if so, why?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think we're watching a playbook, which in a way which goes back a long time actually, but it's being implemented. And I would stress this: not it is being implemented in a more straightforward way, possibly in Eastern Europe, but it was also implemented in the electoral autocracy known as France, against the candidacy of Marie Le Pen, who was ruled out from contesting presidential elections. Um, and I mean, we see the whole development of the EU in terms of labeling views contrary to the official line of things as propaganda or disinformation, and gradually passing directives which is clamping down on any of these dissenting views. And in fact, in most of the EU, you cannot receive a lot of channels, some like Sputnik or RT. And increasingly, that was the baseline that was introduced immediately after February 2022. But it's been extended now to, we see the purging of people from Substack, from Meta, and so forth. And as I said, this is not a new playbook. I mean, this all occurred already, and you may have heard of Operation Gladiator in the late 1940s and early 1950s, to exclude major forces who were leading forces in their countries, like the Communist Party in Italy or whatever, to exclude them from government. And by the Americans simply, well, first of all, a huge propaganda campaign, the discrediting of individuals, the lampooning of views as propaganda and so forth, and also straightforward bribery. There will be no martial aid for countries unless if you continue to have communist ministers in your governments. This was all done in the late 1940s in France, in Italy, and in other countries. And we're basically seeing exactly the same type of playbook. It's obviously been taken down and dusted off, and it's being employed liberally as we see before our eyes, and most graphically in the countries in Eastern Europe. But not only that, we see the moves, the open moves now to try and somehow suspend. I mean, the amount of structural funds and so forth that have been withheld from Hungary and from Slovakia and so forth over their governments not having a compliant view on the confrontation against Russia. As I say, it's an old playbook which has been systematically re-implemented for the new purpose of NATO consolidation of the sphere it has seized in the last 2 decades.
Absolutely. What works, and equally, I don't think when it comes to those tactics, we've actually evolved that much in terms of our humanity. Lucy, the same question to you.
Yes, I mean, just looking at the notes that I made prior to coming on, I've just seen also that this academic in Venice, who's obviously much more familiar with the situation of her sentencing and so on, he says that the Chisinau, the state in Chisinau, is justifying her prosecution under anti-corruption laws, but that the process was marred by procedural irregularities, which included rushed hearings, alleged coercion of witnesses, and extended house arrest without proper reviews. So it certainly seems as though they've really coerced this situation. They've really brought the situation. They're behaving in a very desperate manner now. There's no longer the veil of liberal democracy of the EU and NATO. I mean, it's very obvious now to most of us that the EU and NATO are as one. And they're obviously going to be unrelenting when it comes to Eastern Europe. And I would imagine that that's where a lot of the World War III is going to potentially kick off again, a bit like First World War. Apparently the people in Moldova, when Maya Sandu was elected, they were saying to this journalist, Brett Redmayne, they were already saying, this means that we're going to become the eye of the storm in this war. with Ukraine. And I found it interesting because the article I was reading was published in 2022, and it's now 2025, 3 years later, and we're essentially what he predicted is coming to pass. So that can be found on unz.com, unz.com, the UNZ review, which is a very good resource, unlike mainstream media, which I barely look at all because there's nothing much of any interest in there anymore, just propaganda these days. So
no, I think mainstream media lost its objectivity when you go back as far as 2021, when Ofcom decided to censor a number of things that I have no doubt are connected on some level. NATO at the moment is now extending their base in Romania, which will reportedly be the largest European base in Europe. Philip, do you think NATO is playing a role in all of this?
Yes, NATO. Yes, of course. NATO is the framework. I remember about 2 years ago when you had Macron and people like that talking about greater European autonomy and how they could deal straight with Russia and blah, 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 find agreements and so on. It's all basically a sham. I remember a German, he was an EU diplomat, but of German background. And he was asked, someone asked him, what about this plan for a European army? He said, we already have a European army. It's called NATO.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, even just in the last year or so, the extent to which NATO and the EU have been assimilated one to the other, with the EU as a type of the diplomatic or economic arm of NATO is quite extraordinary. You can see it in all incremental steps and in the Draghi plan for an armaments industry, and with Ursula von der Leyen unilaterally creating this new competence for the EU in organising and integrating a Europe-wide armaments industry, which was never in any European treaty that I remember. And the European Council has been basically set aside. It makes noises every now and then, as it did recently, had qualms over over the Israeli behavior and genocide in Gaza. But essentially, when any decision is now made, it involves the Prime Minister of Brexit Britain, the Chancellor, the what they call it, thank you for doing our dirty work, Chancellor of Germany, and Macron of France, and that's about it, and a few maybe lackey states from the Baltics. And they make the unilateral decisions about what they're going to do next in terms of fortifying the boundaries of NATO, dealing with the external borders, countering threats, as you say, building this their largest base yet in Eastern Europe, in Romania, and so forth.
And the same question to you, Lucy.
Yes, well, I mean, again, referring to this article by Brett, that he's foreseen that in order to take Odessa and for Russia to effectively stop the terror in Ukraine and to get rid of the Nazis and stop new supplies coming in through the Black Sea ports, that they would need to do is have a complete coastal Ukrainian blockade. And in order to get that, they need Odessa under control up to the Zatoka Bridge. I'm not absolutely sure where that is. Might be worth looking that up, Zatoka. And control of the southern east-west front lines along the border, but all the way from Transnistria to Romania. And I think when you look at the map, that's basically why they're going to be building a large base in Romania. They need to make sure, NATO needs to make sure that this doesn't happen. I think Odessa is going to be a pretty nasty battle. However, there are interesting things going on at the moment. I mean, for example, I don't know whether you're able to talk about it, the capture of those 2 British Army colonels and the MI6 agent just off the coast, I think, was it near Kherson, about 3 days ago, which seems to be subject to various Section D notices. Again, do we live in a free country in the West, and in particular in the UK, when there's so much censorship of important developments in the war? Obviously, the UK is not an official party to the conflict. So the Russians have said they're going to jail these people. They're going to put them to trial and jail them. They're not going to be treated like normal POWs. So I don't think it's going particularly well for the West. And obviously you see Trump going around trying to sanction third countries who are buying or selling Russian oil, India, China, Japan. They've all basically said, you know, we're going to continue. So it now looks like he, not Zelensky, is the one with no cards left. He really has no cards. What's he going to do? What do the West have in their quiver, aside from some horrific false flag attack or nuclear attack somewhere, that they can actually get this conflict back under control? Because it seems to me that the Russians are well on the way to victory now.
Very interesting, and even more curious so when it comes to the two colonels that have been arrested. You know, knowing the hierarchy of war and the involvement of a colonel, it would be very interesting as that story unfolds, Lucy.
Yeah.
The Moldovan ruling pro-West Party of Standard have made EU integration part of their core policy. And around 75% of the Gagauzia region under Evghenia Guțul has been governing against joining the EU. I wonder, do you think the EU is playing a part in all of these shenanigans that are going on in Moldova? Lucy, what are your thoughts on that?
Undoubtedly. And I think it's no surprise that people are not necessarily in favour of joining the EU, because even if you go to Greece, people complain about the euro. They complain about how suddenly a cup of coffee was so much more expensive when you paid in euros than when you paid in drachma. Then you had all these problems with the banking in, was it 2011 in Greece, and the financial crisis there. But then you've also got a drain of young people who leave the farming areas, who leave the villages and go to places like London to become cheap labour in our economies. And that's been devastating for these countries. And I remember actually I visited Croatia back in 2017, and they were I always talked to taxi drivers, and the taxi drivers were saying, we don't want to join the euro, we really don't, because we've seen what it's done with other countries, and again with the drain of the young people, which I think this chap says on that clip that you're going to show. But it's a real problem, and yeah, not everyone feels that the EU is a beacon of democracy, and maybe they want self-determination, which they're supposed to be allowed to have under all sorts of human rights laws, whether it's the UN Convention on Human Rights or even EU human rights laws. They're supposed to be allowed to have self-determination, which seems to have gone out of the window, particularly with the people of Donbass region, that we conveniently forgot that they're not allowed to have the right to self-determination.
Absolutely. And the same question to you, Philip.
Yeah, well, I think particularly in accession countries, as they're called, countries either seeking or being forced to seek membership of the EU, it's now been imposed as a condition that when they enter that process of accession to the EU, they have to undertake that they will join the euro when the European Central Bank deems them fit to do so. So there's no way back. And we've seen just in very recent weeks huge protests in Bulgaria, big political divide, because D-Day has arrived for them. They're supposed to be, the date for joining the euro has been decreed by Brussels, and I think it's a month or two from now. And there's a very large antagonism to this occurring in Bulgaria. And I think for poor countries in particular, the transition to the euro currency has proved absolutely traumatic in the way that the Greeks had experienced it. So I think in general, what you can say is that the EU, in following its new geostrategic role, which Ursula von der Leyen declared that it had, which is again never in any treaty that this was a purpose of the EU, that the borders of the EU bloc are going to be firmed up by the imposition of EU regulation and so forth. And that's how it's going to be experienced in these countries. And I can just imagine, and one way, and of course, bribery again plays a huge role. It's Sandu's only card in her hand. If she already got earlier this year a huge tranche of money from the EU as goodwill, what they call it, advanced structural funding. And in a poor country with underdeveloped infrastructure and so forth, this operates as a huge bribe, but people also see it as such. And I just can't imagine that the province in southern Moldova, whose population have expressed continued pro-Russian sentiments and continued anti-EU sentiments, that they can be incorporated into the EU in any way other than force. And we could be looking at a separatist crisis here. I can't see how not. When the political leadership is arrested on trumped up charges, and when the local opinion is ridden roughshod over in the manner that we see occurring.
Absolutely. Lucy, how do you see the future of Evghenia?
Well, I mean, she's been told she's got 7 years in jail. Apparently, she has a young child. It seems to be a sentence which is far outweighs the crimes, completely disproportionate. And again, people like her are being sanctioned while Israel is continuing to get away with actual genocide. There's no boycotting, sanctioning, or divesting of Israel. And I think the normal person in Europe is starting to see the contradictions between the pronounced sort of so-called rules-based value, liberal values, democracy, and so on, and what's actually happening on the ground. And whether it's Ursula von der Leyen and her text messages with the head of Pfizer, which were never made public, and her husband, of course, being one of the people who was going to benefit from that deal because he works in Big Pharma, or whether it's a massive sentence handed down to a young woman merely for the crime of not being a puppet of NATO and the EU, like Kaya Kallas and Maya Sandu, that she's a woman who's actually representing her people, many of whom, thousands they've been out protesting, wanting to have self-determination and autonomy. And there are a high number of ethnic Russians and Ukrainians in Gagauzia, apparently. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens over this. And the stakes are very, very high. And it seems as though NATO and the EU is becoming increasingly severe in its penalties. That's not a strong enough word, actually. But, yeah.
No, it's quite brutal. And Philip, how would you see the future direction of Moldova?
Well, as I said there earlier, Michael, I think it's coming to a crisis point because it's the only way that the EU agenda can be implemented is by the imposition of its regulatory control of the area, especially in these eastern areas of Moldova and bordering on Transnistria and this province in the south, which I'm afraid I can't pronounce right, so I won't say it. Gagauzia, yeah, okay. So I think they're entering very stormy. I mean, they have been in very stormy waters since the 1990s. It's never been a country that has come to peace because it has been torn westwards and eastwards instead of being allowed find what a country like that should be, a type of reconciled position between these different forces. And in the absence of that, the future that Zandu seems so determined on. And remember, Zandu, of course, like all these leaders, she was educated at Harvard and she worked for the World Bank and all these type of things before arising from nowhere in politics. She's just determined on this course, and as we can see, with the terrible treatment of this young woman Guțul, that she will stop at nothing to achieve her goals, and that'll be at the expense of people in Eastern Moldova, And I can't imagine this coming to conclusion without major conflict. Like we see Sandu is regularly, she's very lucky to, I mean, she gets into power by very slight margins. She loses elections. She can't hold coalitions together. And with this type of instability in the country, it just seems a very rough road ahead for the country.
And she's funded by Soros, apparently.
Well, Lucy, yeah, what you got some
So I
more
was
to
just
add
going to
there,
say
Lucy?
she's funded by George Soros, apparently, Maya Sandu.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Global.
Join a long list of people if that's the case,
Yeah.
Lucy. Okay, so before we ask the final question, I think it might be a good idea to take a look at a video that we have. And I believe that this was taken by a Romanian citizen, and I found it very, very interesting. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video.
Let me tell you something. It's not going to start in Paris. It's not going to start in Berlin. It's not going to start in London. The change will start in the East. It's Eastern Europe that's going to snap first, because they've been pushed to the fucking edge. Not with Netflix and Starbucks, not with rainbow flags and safe zones and distractions. With poverty, with militarization, with foreign puppets running the damn show. They said EU will bring prosperity. Where is it? Half their youth is gone working in kitchens abroad. Their governments don't protect them. They sell them. They sell them to Brussels, to NATO, and to whoever pays better. These people, my people, they remember what dictatorship feels like. They remember the propaganda. They remember the checkpoints, the lies dressed as law. They've seen this cycle before. And they are done pretending this is freedom. And when they rise, they won't be asking for reforms. They'll be demanding for heads. They'll be shaking the system, because when obedience becomes death, rebellion is survival. The West won't move until East shows them how. Until one domino falls, until one country says no more lies, no more foreign orders, no more politicians selling us out for a seat at the global table. When that fire catches, it will burn from Bucharest to Brussels, from Sofia to Stockholm, and from Warsaw to Westminster. The change begins in the East, and if you can feel it, then you're already part of it.
And so the final question, firstly, with you, Philip. Do you also believe that there will be an uprising in Eastern Europe over the demise of their countries? And are the institutions such as the EU and NATO, would you say they're to blame for it?
Yeah, well, I think we're very clear, and I think we're all in agreement here, and that we see a systematic approach by the EU, NATO, to, as I said at the start, consolidate their bloc, and including all the newly acquired bits of that bloc in recent years. And it seems they will stop at nothing to complete that. But people aren't passive actors, and I'm not sure that the chap in the video there talk about a red color revolution, that two can play the game of color revolution, and that people especially in these areas in Eastern Europe, are not going to take this passively. And as we all know from history, the thing that people need more than anything else is a perspective, that they can see a future. So you won't get uprisings that are type of hopeless or without perspective or are suicidal in that sense. It'll be when there is another perspective available. And I think this is what is going to be a major outcome of the Ukraine war when it finishes. If it does finish with Russia in a more powerful and consolidated position, that it will provide a realistic alternative perspective for countries seeking a path other than integration into the NATO bloc. And I think that might be the contours of what we'll see develop.
It's a very interesting perspective, Philip. And Lucy, do you have anything to add to that? Leaving the final question with you.
Just to say, really, I think that the Eastern European people remember communism because they've had it most recently. So whether you're talking about the East Germans supporting AFD and wanting to get out of the EU. You had Christine Anderson, who's a member of the AFD in Germany, but she was one of the most awake people on the COVID authoritarianism. And, I think that, I worked in Brussels. That wasn't when I was working for the European Union Special Representative. That was in Afghanistan 20 years ago. But I worked in Brussels for 1 year, 30 years ago. In the agricultural directorate. It was agri-environment policy, it was called. And it was at the time of the accession of Romania. I think it was 93 to 94. And at the time, of course, if you read books like this, Provoked by Scott Horton, and you look at the, hang on, let's just see if I can get that in the right place on my screen. He gives you all the background of the US foreign policy establishment reservations about the expansion of NATO further eastwards. And at the time, apparently, you had this sort of group around Clinton and his supporters, no doubt, probably the Rockefellers and so on, Rothschild, who were trying to push for this expansionism into NATO. And then later on, when I was in Kabul in 2005, working for the EU ambassador, one of my remits was to go around all these NATO bases and go to the meetings. And I was told, you need to try and persuade more of all these countries who are here in Afghanistan to join NATO. So there's been that kind of imperative from, where does it come from? Is it from these big financial powers in London and Wall Street? That they had this imperative, this desire just to create this massive bloc, this NATO bloc, without any care for whether it was going to upset the Russians. In fact, I think they wanted to upset the Russians by just driving a coach and horses through their indivisible security and so on, with no respect for that whatsoever. So yes, this war's been completely provoked, and I don't see a good end. And I'm afraid we still have people in the mainstream media, people who work for, whether it's British newspapers, Sky TV, and so on, they always talked about, unprovoked invasion or Russia's full-scale attack, and they're mindless the way that they talk about this. If it was a full-scale invasion, it would have looked like Baghdad on day one in 2003, but it's been a special military operation, and it has been, Russians only invaded with something like 98,000 men, compared to 450,000 of the Ukrainians. So I think there've been a lot of lies, and I think the mainstream media has been utterly complicit. And I hope that one day that these individuals are held to account for their lies and their complete misleading of the public and their failure to report the truth. Sorry, a bit of a rant there.
No, that's fantastic, Lucy. And it's great to hear both of your opinions, very, very learned and very objective as well. It's a shame that some of our own politicians can't follow that measure. So thank you, Philip. Thank you, Lucy, for coming on the show tonight. I know that people thoroughly enjoy everything that you have to say, and we look forward to welcoming you back at some point.
Thank you very much, Mick. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Michael. Bye, Lucy.
Nice
to talk to you.
And of course, it was lovely having Philip and Lucy on the show again. It never ceases to amaze me that we stray away from some of the basic sovereignty when we talk about sovereignty. And I lose a little bit of heart sometimes when you see what is going on in the world, because our politicians really have no character. They have no character because they lie. They lie like cheap watches. And to be fair, if we were to follow the rules of sovereignty, and the rules of sovereignty go all the way back to Alfred when he said, cause no harm, loss or injury to any other man or woman and be honourable in your contracts. If we only followed those rules, we wouldn't have anywhere near the same level of problems that we currently experience across the globe. there we go. That's just my perspective on what is always a very, very complex situation. Now, just to let you know, and I'd like to say thank you for everyone that tunes in and watches and gets involved. We won't be here next week, but there will be a second instalment of our sister One State Palatine broadcast at 7 p.m. UK time on Friday, the 15th of August. Now, I reckon you don't really want to miss that. There's going to be some very interesting stuff on that. So I wish you all very, very well. And we hope that you tune in next time so that we can share even more information with you.